Okay, so I would like to, because I get a lot of personal messages, is what are the features of a dimensioning saw, and what can it do, and generally how is it set up. So I'm going to start with just the basic functions and go through them to show you what is maybe different or similar to other machines. Now, of course, this is a sliding machine, and the table is fixed in this position as it sits, and there's a little lever here that you just pop out, and now that slides. So we're now sliding. And what's interesting about the PK, which I didn't realize until later years, is I'm actually sitting flat on the floor, and this saw is purposely lower on this end, the far end, than it is at this end, and this aids in the saw rolling. This is kind of good. Now you have a handle on the side here to draw it back. This handle is half 12, and this can be placed in a number of locations to control this wherever it becomes convenient. Now it also contains a filler strip here. It can be removed and the miter be put in here. There may be functions. I don't find it necessary to do that. I hardly use this miter anymore, but it is possible to do that, and some people might find the saw with this missing. Probably because the double miter, Americans call that a quadrant, English call that a double miter, and they call this a protractor. Americans call that a miter. Now what's interesting else about the sliding table is there are locking handles underneath, right here, and you would just undo those or loosen them. They're pretty simple, really, and you loosen those and you can open the table. It's pretty easy. You can bump it into a certain place. You can refresh this edge, and that edge can be at any width. That edge can actually be that wide, okay? And generally this is where we would change the blade from, not from the front flask. Right now in there is a stub arbor for a 18-inch blade, but you could get the Daito Arbor. Now the Daito Arbor is threads over top. If you can look in there, you might see that this just hubs over top of the existing stub arbor, matches the plate, and you'd use spacers here to, you'd either use that spacer or not, and you could stack up to 2-inch wide dados. That's how a dado cut is done. And then you would make a block that has a dado cutout on that. The sliding table was never meant to be used with a trenching head. Robinsons and others have little areas to add here, which would allow that to be used, and I think that's an awesome feature. At any rate, that's what its purpose is for sliding open. It's to allow larger cutter blocks in there. I also find it very handy for removing fences. So, you just tuck this back over. You can have it a 0 clearance if you want chip-free cutting. But the blade spins so fast, I don't really need it. Now, I personally like this here, but like I said, it can go in a number of places. Okay, so now what the sliding table has is what I explained earlier was the double miter. Typically, The American model quadrant fence is only the single parts. You could almost say that looks like an Oliver. That would be its handle, and it moves along a fence. Some may have gauging cut in, and I don't know if you can see that, but if you look closely, you can see there's actually etchings in the table, carved in, and that is your protractor setup. So of course the Wadkin can be used with just a single miter. Here is the pin. Here's the pin for the double miter. And the bores are the same, and so these go together, and this bottom shoulder bottoms out in there and doesn't actually pinch the fence. So you actually tighten that down, and that space that's left there does not pinch those. It holds it firmly but doesn't pinch it. Small little detail. So not really generally a bolt. It is machined to be dimensionally here to here to match these two castings. You could, the Wadkin PP fence, which is very similar to this, actually increased the bore in this top section and used what was called a stepped pin. I'll see if I can locate that. Thought I had it out. Yes, I did. Okay, so here is a Wadkin PP pin. You can see that it is got two steps. So it's got a step for the first section of the pivot and the second section of the pivot. And what this pin is a much better design is, it allows me to lock the single section down and use the single section without the double section. The original one did not allow that per se with its pivot, and so it could lift here, not that it does, but this is a better design. So using, I store my handle in the extension holes for the big cross slide, and this is the pivot point for the typical gauge settings. There are a number of locations this can be set. Okay, and you put in your lock, and you can, of course, adjust your angle off of the gauge. If you need to move to another section, you move this to the next location and continue on. Now you can see right away that the table's going to cut that off. I've seen a few of these get cut, and I hope that when I further explain this, there's different setups to avoid that for getting sharp angles. At any rate, this is what I call the default setting of the double miter. This little thing here is a spring-loaded pin. Right now, it has a little pinhole, and you can see I can pull it up and move it so, and that holds that pin, a little pin underneath there, from dropping into the preset holes. So you would just slide that along, and that drops right into a preset. In this case, there are miters, octagons, pentagons. This is all set up in the test department at Wadkin, and those are perfectly set. And so you can either have this pulled up so that the gauge doesn't drop into those holes, or you can have it spring loaded so that it'll pop in to the presets. And there's a 90, and there's a number of them. Okay. So now let me show you the double miter and the functions of the double miter. So the double miter is, of course, of a different animal. So once again, you would drop that into this hole in the preset, in the default setting. Okay, we're going to put our lock here. We're going to put our lock here. Now, what good is that back fence? Well, what's interesting is, if I put this, I don't know, maybe you've cut picture frames, and you want to cut down the fiber of wood. So let's say we're doing a standard picture frame in a 45-degree miter, and we want to cut with fiber constantly laying down, or we want to do, that's locked in a 45 degree. Now the gauge that's in the table is only referenced off of this pivot. In other words, I can't swing the back here and use this gauge. It's not in the same pivoting point, okay? It would be virtually impossible to do that. There might be a way that's very clever. But what Wadkin did was, they put a little scratch line here that says miter. You line your back fence up to that scratch line and you lock it. That now puts this fence at 90 degrees, and this whole thing can be shifted out. We're always maintaining 90 degrees. Now there are, so in other words, if I go to miter and lock that down, that's 45, that's 45. Inversely, if I was to lock this down here and bring that to there, those become complementary as well, and I can slide that through a number of rotations. So mathematically, there are a number of things that can do. Okay, so that is your typical location. And you know, you would unlock the table, you would bring your saw back to here. So let's say we're going to set it up for miter. I'm going to bring it to miter. Okay, and we want to miter two things. So I'll grab a piece of walnut and we'll cut. Now, let me explain the crown guard. The crown guard is an overhead guard, and it has what's called a nose piece. And how this is generally set up is you want the guard, this portion of the crown, to at least cover the gullets. And that's accomplished over here by unlocking this and just dropping that down and then locking it again. So I'll bring that into position, and you know, and that just keeps your fingers from getting into the teeth. Okay, so I get that pretty close and I lock that. Typically, what you would do with the nose guard is you adjust that to your piece. So in other words, you bring that down so your finger can't get in there. And that's typically how you would set it up. Okay, I always like to check that everything's clearing, and everything is clearing. So I'm typically ready to cut, and with that setup. One thing I do like in particular about this crown guard is the this little detail right here. I don't know if you can see that or not. Sorry, but there is a slot. Now that typically was a bolt when I got it, and I just did a little handle, and I can loosen that handle and just rotate my guard out of the way for changing blades, or in situations where I'm actually doing a tenon and I can't use crown guard, and then this gets just popped back into the place and I lock it down. So I typically like that. I'd be curious to see what others are like. At any rate, here's the position for miter, and so I would cut, okay, and both of those are complementary joints. And of course we can do some other things. Now, what other things can what other things can be done here? Well, of course, this is the preset location. And to increase capacity of the table, in other words, how much space do I have between here and here? There's other locations. And so I'll show you that. This is when we're wanting to do large crosscuts. We can move back a location. Okay, this no longer uses the etched scribe, but allows us, and it has a preset as well, so that presets it at 90 and gives us 36 inches here in front of the blade. Now, if you wanted to get clever, you could probably put it back in one of the 5/8 holes that's made for it, but this holds that lock. Okay, and this allows a number of things. One of them being is this allows us back here to have what I call, you can also see that there's a preset at the back setting that pops into there. Do you see that? This little hole that seems odd, that locks us at 45. Now, if we had set that up at 45 on the default setting and then stuck it there, that would be 45. So this gives us a capacity at 45 and a capacity at a 90 Pinlock settings. Okay, so I think that is a unique feature over the American sliders. Okay. Also, this is really, I think, when I see some of these saws having cut into that because they wanted an increased steep angle, they really should have set the saw up here. We can get pretty steep here. We can get steeper if we wanted to, but that's the limit that Wadkin has set on our steepness here. And of course, we do not have, we can also cut square back there, so we have a range back there. Okay? The handle that I had here, which pops off, can of course be placed in a number of locations that would make it handy to do a number of setups, and I can either clamp stuff onto there and guide it through with my hand well out of the way. I think that's an awesome feature. The Wadkin PK also has an embedded steel ruler to 1/16 of an inch, and it also has this little feature right here. That's a kerf setting. That kerf setting is an interesting little feature in that if I have the quadrant set up and I want to know where the blade is cutting, I'll show you how you use that. And what's useful about it is, I don't think this is a very hard thing to set up. And I'll set it up for 90. So here we are. This is going to preset to 90. There's 90. We've locked that out of the way. We're ready to roll. Now my little kerf setting is right there's the front of that kerf setting. But that little part's the other side of the blade. And so what sometimes has happened is if we're working to lines, which in a lot of cases we are, that's a really nice feature to have. I can see it out here instead of me steeping down to get the cut. And I think that that's a wonderful feature. And so I've seen that on other saws, Martins and stuff like that. Now people wonder, what are these fences like to move around? They look awful heavy and antique, and they look real pretty, but really how well do they function. You can see I only had to turn that slightly, and this fence slides very easy, despite it being over 150 pounds. What it does, which is quite interesting, is this plate tilts. In other words, this whole thing tilts, and here's your gauge. Although this is something that would have been used on a table with a fixed arbor that didn't tilt, and so what you do is you tilt your fence to cut work. But it does have other unique features, and I think actually keeping it in a pattern maker saw is great. It also has some unique setting screws here and here and here and here that rest against the plate, and can adjust that toe, but they can also adjust it if it has twist front and back. So you would loosen this, and this whole plate slides off. So we can have rip positions. The only thing I think it's lacking over a modern sliding rip plate fence is the high-low, and so the addition of a low fence, which is really just an L fence that allows us to keep the crown guard and still get in here to do narrow strip ripping, is wonderful. Now, what's fantastic about this fence really is this is your fine adjustment. And you would generally use your gauge, and you'd slide that over and you go, okay, that's roughly where I want, and you lock that down. Okay? This still allows for the fine adjustment to be used. The milling of the block of that is just a tiny bit thicker than the block here. That allows that to lock that down, give enough play that I can still adjust with the fine adjusting, and then lock my location. You don't even need to really lock your location. It's so solidly rigid. And so I just want to show you that this fence is very easy to adjust. Even though it's 150 pounds, and I haven't even got Matt's Amco bronze pieces in there, so I think it's fabulous. At any rate, there's the fence out of your way. For removing the fence, it would slide off. Just slide right off the table. Now, of course, I have extended the fence here, and what I found is all I have to do if I want to remove the fence is remove this top piece. I'll slide this back, okay, or I'll slide this back until it lifts off, and I just tip it up. And you can see that this is a dovetail, okay, that slides in here, and that's basically it. So you'd stick that on, and I find this is a safe way to move the fence. You're not carrying it. I believe a lot of these get dropped, and so you just drop that back on, put your piece, if you don't drop the washers, and you are back in business. Okay? I'm not sure, but the miter is pretty massive. Okay, I'm gonna go get my general in comparison. Here is the general, 10-inch general miter, just so you've got an idea of the scale. Okay, the scale is massive. The Wadkin miter, or protractor is the proper term. Unlike the general, or the typical saw, will rotate to more than 180 degrees. Okay? which means you can virtually do from 0, 180 degrees. This is sometimes very, very useful. No more little cheater angles and then adding numbers. This goes all the way around. So this is quite nice. Also, very long, very wide. Just an awesome feature. And that's about it. You know, so I don't know if this will be helpful to those wondering if you know, if there is any use to the double miter, and why don't I just use the you know, the miter gauge and stuff. You could never get me, of course, to agree with that. I think these are just awesome fixtures on this saw. Very useful today. It's not an antiquated device by any means, and so I think it's lovely. I'll make a cut. Thank you.